but Eisenhower refused to meet him.
Today, we're looking at how a single elk hunter from Montana paralyzed an entire German SS unit using skills the Army never taught him. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a masterclass in long-range psychological warfare that changed the map of the Ardennes. Stick around to see how one man's 500-yard precision turned a 300-man encirclement into a killing field.
At 8:15 on the freezing morning of December 19th, 1944, Sergeant William Buck Anderson lay prone in the snow-covered Belgian forest, watching 300 German soldiers tighten an iron ring around his isolated company. He was 31 years old, a seasoned elk hunter from Livingston, Montana, with 6 confirmed kills already under his belt. The 40 remaining men of Easy Company were in a desperate situation. They were surrounded in the brutal Ardennes forest, cut off during the massive German winter offensive, and their ammunition crates were nearly empty. German forces had them pinned in a small forest clearing with 0 escape routes. To the Germans, it was just a matter of time. To the Americans, it felt like the end. But Anderson wasn't like the other soldiers. While they carried the standard semi-automatic M1 Garand, Anderson gripped a bolt-action 1903 Springfield, equipped with a massive 8-power Unertl scope. It was a heavy, temperamental setup that his company commander, Captain James Walsh, had repeatedly called a waste of space during training. Walsh had told Anderson multiple times to leave the hunting rifle behind and carry standard-issue gear. The platoon sergeant even mocked him, saying that shooting at individual targets from 400 yards would do nothing but give away their position and waste precious bullets. They told him that an elk hunter from Montana had no business telling infantry how to fight a professional siege. That morning, when Anderson proposed his plan to pick off the Germans at extreme range, the captain asked him if he'd finally lost his mind. Anderson didn't argue with military theory. He spoke from experience. He explained that he had spent 15 years hunting elk at long range in the unforgiving Montana mountains. He knew how to read the wind as it whipped through granite peaks. He knew how to calculate the drop of a bullet over hundreds of yards of empty space. The captain countered that elk hunting and high-intensity combat were 2 completely different worlds. Anderson didn't blink. He just kept his rifle ready. The Germans were advancing methodically. They were elite troops using probing attacks to test the American perimeter. They stayed at a distance of 350 to 400 yards, well outside the effective point-blank range of the American M1 Garands. In the eyes of the German officers, they were perfectly safe. They were effectively invisible to the standard American rifleman. But they didn't know about the Montana man behind the fallen tree. Anderson's Springfield had an effective range of 600 yards in the right hands, and his hands were the best in the business. He had spent his youth making 500-yard shots on moving elk in the shivering Montana wind. To him, a German soldier standing in the Belgian snow was an easier target than a nervous buck in the Absaroka range. The situation for Easy Company had turned critical the day before, on December 18th, when the full weight of the German 6th SS Panzer Army hit their lines. American units had scattered under the pressure of heavy panzers and relentless artillery. Easy Company had been separated from their battalion, and by nightfall found themselves 2 miles behind enemy lines. They occupied a small clearing, low on food, 0 radio contact, and freezing. Captain Walsh had called an emergency meeting in the dark. Their options were grim. Attempt a breakout through enemy-held territory with wounded men, or hold the position and pray that an American counteroffensive reached them before they were overrun. Walsh chose to hold. He ordered his men to dig in, conserve every single bullet, and wait for a miracle. Before we get into the first shot that broke the German morale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. It helps the algorithm share these incredible stories of American veterans with the world. Anderson settled into his position. He chose a spot behind a massive fallen pine on the northern edge of the clearing. He was prone. His rifle rested solidly on the bark. He didn't fire. He waited. He watched through the Unertl scope, which gave him a crystal-clear view of the German lines 400 yards away. He could see the German soldiers conferring, setting up their MG-42 machine guns and pointing toward the American holes. They were relaxed, confident, and exposed. At 8:23, Anderson spotted his first target. A German officer directing troops 380 yards away. The man was standing tall, pointing a map and shouting orders. Anderson watched him for 30 seconds, calculating the 2-mile-per-hour crosswind from the left. He adjusted his hold, aiming 6 inches above the officer's head to compensate for the 380-yard drop. His finger found the trigger. A custom 3-pound brake he had tuned himself. He squeezed. The Springfield kicked. The report cracked like a whip through the frozen trees, and the German officer jerked and fell instantly. The surrounding soldiers dove for cover in pure shock. They had no idea where the shot came from. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. The first shot didn't just kill an officer. It shattered the German illusion of safety. As the body hit the frozen ground, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the Ardennes forest. The German soldiers, who moments before had been confidently prepping their positions, were now paralyzed. They couldn't see where the fire was coming from, but they knew one thing. Someone out there could reach through 400 yards of fog and snow to deliver a death sentence. Anderson didn't celebrate. In the mountains of Montana, you don't celebrate a hit. You work the bolt and prepare for the next one. He felt the cold steel of the bolt handle against his palm, pulled it back to eject the smoking brass, and chambered a fresh point 30-06 round. This was the geometry of death, a phrase later used by military historians to describe how Anderson redefined the battlefield. Most infantry engagements in the 1940s happened within 200 yards. Beyond that, Accuracy dropped off sharply for the average soldier with iron sights. But Anderson was operating on a different plane. He wasn't just aiming, he was calculating. He looked at the trees to see how the wind was bending the smaller pine needles. He watched the light snowfall to gauge the density of the air. To him, the Germans were static variables in a complex equation he had been solving since he was 16. At 8:41, a German soldier tried to make a break for it, sprinting between two thick oaks about 410 yards out. It was a fast move, meant to test the Americans' reaction time. Anderson didn't rush. He led the target, placing the crosshairs of the Unertl scope exactly where the man's chest would be in half a second. He squeezed. The soldier went down in mid-stride, skidding into the snow. 2 shots, 2 kills. The Germans now realized they weren't just facing a lucky rifleman. They were facing a professional predator. The psychological weight of this realization cannot be overstated. When you are in a forest and you know that any movement, no matter how far away, results in a bullet to the head, your will to fight begins to evaporate. Captain Walsh, watching through his binoculars from a foxhole, saw the change in the enemy's behavior. The Germans stopped advancing. They stopped shouting orders. They became invisible, cowering behind trees and in shallow ditches. They were pinned by a single man. Walsh crawled over to Anderson's position. He saw the spent casings in the snow and the calm, rhythmic breathing of the sergeant. He realized then that the elk-hunting rifle he had tried to ban was the only reason they were still alive. Anderson had turned the clearing into a fortress, with a 400-yard moat of lethal precision. By 9:02, Anderson claimed his third victim. A German soldier had crawled out to set up an MG-42 machine gun behind a rocky outcrop, thinking the terrain would protect him at 395 yards. Anderson waited until the man's shoulder and head were exposed for just a moment as he adjusted the tripod. The Springfield cracked again. The gunner collapsed over his weapon, and his assistant fled into the woods, leaving the powerful machine gun useless in the snow. By 9:30, Anderson had fired 8 rounds, 6 confirmed kills. The Germans had completely ceased their offensive. They were terrified. They had been trained to fight armies, not a ghost who could see them through the trees at distances that defied logic. It's incredible how one person with the right tool can change the course of a battle. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, make sure you've liked the video and hit that notification bell. We have 2 more massive blocks of this story coming up next. The Germans tried to adapt. They realized that staying still was their only hope. But even that wasn't enough. Anderson was glassing the woods, looking for the slightest glint of a helmet or the puff of a breath in the cold air. He told Walsh he had 17 rounds left. In his mind, that meant 17 more Germans wouldn't be going home. The siege had technically reversed. The 300 Germans were now the ones being hunted, trapped in a perimeter of fear created by a man who treated them no differently than the bulls he'd tracked through the Absaroka Range for over a decade. By 1:20 p.m., the forest had become a psychological prison for the Germans. They had a massive numerical advantage, but in their minds, they weren't fighting a company of 40 men anymore. They were fighting a ghost who controlled every inch of the air between the trees. Anderson noticed a shift in movement to the south. The Germans were trying to reposition, attempting to flank the American foxholes from a new angle where they thought they might be hidden by thicker brush. Anderson didn't panic. He adjusted his position slightly, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had spent a decade stalking elk without snapping a single twig. He glassed the area through the Unertl scope and spotted a German NCO directing the movement. Distance, 405 yards. Anderson didn't even hesitate. He led the target, breathed out, and squeezed the trigger. The NCO dropped instantly. The flanking maneuver died right there in the snow. The German soldiers simply stopped moving. They refused to be the next target for the unseen marksman. By 2 p.m., Anderson had fired 20 rounds. He had 16 confirmed kills and 4 misses. The psychological effect was absolute and total. The Germans had ceased all offensive operations. They maintained their positions, but they made no more attempts to close the distance. They knew a sniper controlled every approach. Nobody wanted to be number 17. Captain Walsh gathered his men. He looked at his watch and then at the shivering soldiers in the foxholes. The Germans hadn't attacked in over 2 hours. Anderson's shooting hadn't just killed enemy soldiers, it had bought them time, the most precious commodity in war. A relief column was supposed to reach them by nightfall, and thanks to one man from Montana, they actually had a chance to see it. But the Germans weren't done yet. Frustrated and humiliated by their inability to overrun a handful of Americans, the German officers tried one final desperate push at 2:30 p.m. Through his scope, Anderson could see them rallying their troops. Officers were standing up, screaming, pointing toward the American clearing, trying to force their men into a final charge. Anderson focused. He picked out the first officer at 415 yards. The Springfield cracked. The officer fell. 30 seconds later, a second officer tried to take his place. Anderson was already reloaded. He fired again, both kills. Without their leadership, the German attack collapsed before it even started. The soldiers retreated back into the deeper woods. Anderson now had 18 kills and only 7 rounds remaining in his pouch. The final German push came at 3 p.m. This time, they used everything they had. They opened up with a heavy artillery preparation, followed by infantry advancing under intense covering fire from multiple directions. Walsh's men engaged with everything: bars, M1 Garands, and machine guns. The air was filled with lead and the smell of cordite. But while the rest of the company fought the mass of infantry, Anderson focused only on the leaders. He shot a German NCO at 390 yards, then another at 410. He spotted a third organizing troops behind a fallen log at 435 yards. 3 more shots, 3 more hits. By the time the German attack stalled at the 300-yard mark, Anderson was down to his last 4 rounds. The American fire was too heavy, and the loss of leadership was too great. The Germans withdrew for the final time. During the retreat, Anderson took his longest shot of the day, hitting a fleeing soldier at 445 yards. 22 kills, 3 rounds left. At 4:30 p.m., the distant rhythmic thud of American artillery echoed through the forest. It wasn't the German guns this time. It was the relief column. The Germans heard it too. They began a full-scale withdrawal, pulling back their lines before the American reinforcements could trap them. Anderson watched through his scope as a final German officer tried to direct the retreat. He was 425 yards away. Anderson took his time. He thought about a bull elk he had shot back in 1938. The same distance, the same uphill angle, the same biting wind. He squeezed. The 23rd shot was his final kill of the day. At 5 p.m., the lead elements of the American relief column finally broke through to Easy Company's position. The siege was over. 40 men had held off 300 elite German soldiers for 9 brutal hours. As the commanders debriefed, Captain Walsh led them to Anderson's position. He showed them the spent shell casings, 23 of them, neatly piled in the snow. When the commander of the relief column asked Anderson how he managed to make those shots at 400-plus yards with a bolt-action rifle, Anderson didn't talk about military doctrine. He talked about Montana. He talked about 15 years of practice, about reading the wind, about the patience required to wait for the perfect shot. He said, "1 shot, 1 kill. That's how we do it back home." Anderson survived the war, but he didn't stay in the military to collect medals. Despite being offered a transfer to a specialized sniper unit, he chose to stay with Easy Company until the end of the conflict. By February 1945, his tally had reached 31 confirmed kills, all at ranges exceeding 350 yards. He eventually spent 3 months training other soldiers, teaching them the fundamentals he had learned in the Absaroka Range: wind reading, elevation compensation, and most importantly, the discipline to wait. By May 1945, his students had recorded 147 confirmed kills using his techniques. When the war ended, Anderson didn't look for fame. He returned to Livingston, Montana, in November 1945 and took over his father's hunting guide service. For the next 30 years, he guided hunters through the same mountains that had prepared him for the most important day of his life. He kept the 1903 Springfield and the Unertl scope, hanging them over his fireplace. When clients would ask about the rifle, he would simply say he used it during the war. He never mentioned the 23 Germans or the 40 Americans whose lives he saved. It wasn't until 1977 that a military historian digging through old after-action reports found the story of the hunter of the Ardennes. He tracked Anderson down in Montana. By then, Bill was 64 years old, still guiding hunters through the wilderness. He confirmed the details, but downplayed his role, insisting that any elk hunter could have done the same. He told the historian that during those 6 hours of intense combat, he wasn't thinking about the war. He was thinking about a specific elk he'd tracked in 1938. The calculations were the same. The patience was the same. The target was just a different shape. William Buck Anderson passed away in 1995 at the age of 82. His obituary mentioned his service and his business, but it omitted the incredible statistics of his marksmanship. Today, his rifle sits in a display case in Helena, Montana. Most people walk past it without a second glance. But in the halls of U.S. Army sniper training, his story is still told. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the best military skills aren't found in a manual. They are found in the mountains, in the silence of a hunt, and in the steady hand of a man who knows exactly when to pull the trigger. Anderson proved that one accurate rifleman, fueled by a lifetime of experience, can change the outcome of a battle and the course of history. That is the legacy of the Montana elk hunter who saved Easy Company.